On the first Sunday of June, the village of Netherdean awoke to the promise of roses and scandal. The sun, warm but not overbearing, gilded the lawns and hedgerows with a golden hush, and the scent of lavender hung in the air as if it had been painted on. Church bells had barely finished their morning call when the tables were being laid in the garden of Colonel and Mrs. Halbert's home, a spacious Georgian cottage with wisteria-choked walls and an enviable view of the village green. The annual Garden Club luncheon was a much-anticipated affair, second only to the harvest supper in terms of gossip potential. It attracted the village's most committed horticulturists and those who pretended to be for the sake of appearances. Mrs. Halbert, an enthusiastic if erratic gardener, was not known for letting a weed go unchallenged, or a rumor either. Among the guests arriving in their best floral prints and freshly polished brogues was Miss Jane Marple, whose attendance was considered something of a quiet seal of respectability for any gathering. She wore her customary straw hat and carried a small parasol, though she rarely seemed to notice the sun. She greeted everyone with polite warmth and took a seat beside the rhododendrons, murmuring her delight at the cream puffs. Tea was being poured, and the vicar's wife was recounting her latest battle with black spot-on roses when a shriek broke the afternoon calm. It came from the far end of the lawn, where Mrs. Ruth Felton, newly returned to the village after 15 years abroad, had been taking a quiet stroll with a glass of elderflower cordial. The guests turned as one, teacups freezing mid-air. Ruth stood near the hedge, face pale, pointing at something just behind the greenhouse. Colonel Halbert was the first to reach her, followed by Dr. Hayward and the formidable Mrs. Hartley Finch. Miss Marple, quietly setting down her plate, followed at a gentler pace. Behind the greenhouse, sprawled awkwardly with one arm bent beneath him and his head turned at an unnatural angle, lay Edwin Leston, book collector, antique dealer, and general subject of whispered suspicions in the village. His spectacles were cracked, one lens missing entirely, and beside him lay a small garden trowel. A neat wound on the side of his skull gleamed red in the sun. "He's dead," murmured Dr. Hayward after a swift check. "Been dead some time, I should think." Colonel Halbert straightened, face grave. "Call the police." There was a long, stunned silence. "But how awful," Ruth whispered, clutching her necklace. "I just came back to water the hydrangeas. I never thought." Miss Marple, eyes gentle and unfocused, said softly, "It's odd, isn't it, how his shadow falls to the west, though the sun is still high in the east." Curious. No one noticed her words at first. They were lost in the hum of panic and hurried footsteps, but Miss Marple was already thinking of shadows, of unspoken feuds, and of how death never arrived without first slipping through the village under another name. She took her teacup again, though her appetite had gone. There would be a great deal to consider now, and someone, she suspected, had just made a terrible mistake. As the sun continued to bathe the garden in deceptive warmth, a hush settled over the gathering. The once cheerful clinking of teacups and laughter had given way to murmurs and shifting feet. The party dissolved naturally, people drifting in uncertain clumps toward the edge of the lawn. Colonel Halbert, with stiff military precision, was directing a young footman to telephone the police from the study. Dr. Hayward had gently moved Ruth Felton to a bench and was speaking to her in low tones, his manner both reassuring and distracted. Miss Marple remained where she was for some moments longer, her eyes not on the body, but on the greenhouse and the surrounding area. She seemed almost lost in thought, mild, unassuming, but those who knew her well would have recognized the focused gleam behind the pleasant vagueness. Presently, she approached the spot behind the greenhouse, though she made no move to cross the boundary marked by a scattered length of cord now forming an impromptu perimeter, thanks to Colonel Halbert's firm instructions. Edwin Leston lay crumpled near the hedge, his legs at a curious angle as though he had tried to turn suddenly. "Strange thing," Colonel Halbert muttered to her, noticing her approach. No signs of a struggle, and yet, well, he certainly didn't fall that way by accident. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Poor Mr. Leston. A private sort of man, but one always felt he was holding something tightly in, don't you think? Secrets tend to do that. They ferment. Colonel Halberd looked at her sidelong, not entirely certain what she meant, but unwilling to appear slow. He cleared his throat and turned back toward the house, as the sound of an approaching motor car reached their ears. Detective Inspector Craddock arrived with familiar efficiency. He was a stocky, dependable man with a no-nonsense air and a genuine, if occasionally exasperated, respect for Miss Marple. She had once helped him solve a nasty little case involving a poisoned box of chocolates and a missing gold brooch, and he had never forgotten it. "Well," he said as he stepped onto the lawn, flanked by a young constable and a plainclothes assistant, "I suppose I need not ask if there are witnesses." He glanced toward the greenhouse. "That's him, is it?" "Edwin Leston," said Colonel Halberd. "Antique dealer, lived in Ivygate Cottage. Not exactly popular, but not openly quarrelsome. The body was discovered by Mrs. Ruth Felton. She'd gone round the back to inspect the hydrangeas, apparently." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Hydrangeas? Well, why not?" He turned and gave a brief nod to Miss Marple. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple. I suppose you've already reached your own conclusions." She smiled with unassuming sweetness. "Oh dear me, no. I wouldn't presume. But I did wonder about the shadow." Craddock paused. "The shadow? It pointed the wrong way," she said simply. "Mr. Leston was lying quite close to the greenhouse, and the sun was behind it at the time. Yet his shadow pointed westward, not toward the east as it should have done, which suggests he wasn't killed there, or at least not at that time of day." Craddock looked thoughtful. We'll check time of death with Dr. Hayward. Might be something in that." As the officers began their methodical work, Miss Marple drifted back toward the cluster of guests still lingering on the lawn. Conversations had grown hushed and speculative. "It's always the quiet ones," murmured Mrs. Hartley Finch to anyone who would listen. "Mark my words, he was mixed up in something." "Rubbish," said Mr. Langley, the village solicitor. "Probably just a tragic accident. Greenhouse steps can be slippery." "Was he even in the greenhouse?" asked Vera Long, the vicar's niece, sharp-eyed and perpetually on the edge of indignation. "I saw him arguing with someone 2 days ago outside the post office. He didn't look like he was about to fall into a bed of begonias then." "Arguing with whom?" Miss Marple asked gently. Vera blinked. "I didn't recognize them." A woman. Tall, wore a scarf even though it was sweltering. Foreign, maybe, at least not from around here. The group absorbed this with relish. At that moment, Craddock reappeared. "Dr. Hayward estimates the time of death to be between 10 and noon. You're quite right, Miss Marple. The shadow would not have fallen that way during the Garden Club luncheon. Which raises the question, who moved the body and why?" The tension on the lawn thickened. It was one thing to accept a sudden death, another to believe that someone among them had deliberately manipulated the scene of a murder. Ruth Felton, now pale but composed, was giving her statement near the terrace. She glanced frequently toward the others, her hands clenched in her lap. Miss Marple sat beside her with a sympathetic smile. "You must be quite shaken, my dear. Such an unpleasant thing to stumble upon. Tell me, did you see anyone as you went toward the greenhouse?" "No," Ruth said quickly. "No one. I came around the side hedge. There's a small gate. I was alone. I wasn't expecting anyone to be there at all." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "But you knew the path well?" "It hasn't changed since you were last here." Ruth blinked. "I suppose not. I mean, I lived in Nether Dean until I was 18. I know every inch of that garden." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "It's comforting in a way to return to what's familiar." Though one never knows how people change, do they? Ruth looked at her sharply, but Miss Marple had already turned her gaze toward the flower beds. As the afternoon wore on, more pieces of the puzzle were quietly collected. Edwin Leston's cottage was sealed and would be searched later. His business dealings were already being whispered about. Apparently, he had recently acquired a rare book from a questionable source, and there had been rumors of a legal dispute with a former client. Miss Marple found herself walking along the edge of the garden with Reverend Miles, who had joined the gathering only after the discovery of the body. "Such a terrible thing," he said sadly. "Death always seems to come rudely, doesn't it, when one least expects it?" "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, "though it does rather tend to arrive where there has already been disturbance. It is not always the beginning, you know. Sometimes it is the end of something long set in motion." The Reverend frowned slightly. "You believe this wasn't sudden?" "I believe," she said carefully, "that when someone dies in the middle of a village gathering, behind a greenhouse, with no sign of a scuffle and a misplaced shadow, then one must ask not how he died, but why he was placed there." She glanced back toward the hedge, and who might have benefited from his presence being noticed, or perhaps from his absence being misunderstood. The Reverend looked puzzled, but Miss Marple gave no further elaboration. Evening crept slowly over Nether Dean. The police were wrapping up for the day, though Craddock would be returning in the morning. Guests had filtered away in pairs and trios, the scandal of the event giving them no shortage of conversation to chew on. Only Miss Marple remained behind for a few minutes more, watching as the last streak of sun dipped behind the church spire. She bent once more to examine the path behind the greenhouse. Something glittered faintly among the grass. Carefully, she reached down and picked up a small, delicate brooch, no more than an inch across, in the shape of a bee. She turned it over once in her hand, then tucked it gently into her reticule. Human nature, she reflected, never changed. It hid itself behind the polite rituals of tea and garden parties, but it always, inevitably, betrayed itself. And this particular betrayal, she suspected, was far from over. The next morning dawned cool and misty, the village of Nether Dean wrapped in a grey shawl of fog that seemed reluctant to lift. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and sat by the kitchen window in her modest cottage, the soft light revealing the familiar edges of her well-tended garden. Yet her thoughts were far from the sweet peas and foxgloves. The murder of Edwin Leston hung over the village like a shadow, uneasy, unexplained, and wholly unwelcome. Over her morning tea, Miss Marple reviewed the small bee brooch she had found the previous afternoon. It was finely wrought, of an older style, certainly not something commonly worn these days. The clasp was broken, as if hastily removed or damaged during a struggle. She suspected it belonged to someone who was present at the garden party, or perhaps someone who wished to leave a trace without being noticed. Her reverie was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was her neighbor, Mrs. McGillicuddy, clutching a knitted shawl and looking quite perturbed. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said breathlessly. "I thought I might find you here." "It's dreadful, all of it. The poor man. I never liked him, but one never wishes such things." "Yes, it is unsettling," Miss Marple replied gently. "Have you heard anything new?" Mrs. McGillicuddy shook her head. "No, just more whispers, as usual. Some say it was the stranger, Mrs. Felton's friend, that tall woman with the scarf. Others blame the solicitor, Mr. Langley. People don't seem to trust anyone these days." Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is the nature of small villages. When the unexpected arrives, everyone scrambles for a piece of the puzzle, often fitting it to their own fears and prejudices. As Mrs. McGillicuddy left, Miss Marple resolved to visit Edwin's cottage. If there were secrets to be found, they would likely be there. The cottage stood a short walk from the village centre, a modest building with ivy creeping up one side and a small overgrown garden. The front door was sealed with police tape, but Craddock was on site, examining the interior with his usual methodical care. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with a nod. "Good morning. I suppose you wanted to see the scene for yourself." "Indeed," she replied. "I always find that the atmosphere of a place reveals more than words sometimes." Craddock gestured for her to enter. The cottage was dim inside, the curtains drawn to preserve the privacy of the deceased. Bookshelves lined the walls, heavy with dusty volumes and odd trinkets. On the small writing desk sat a ledger, open to a page filled with names and dates. Edwin was a meticulous man, Craddock said. Or so it seemed. "But look here, there are several recent entries marked with asterisks." Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. "Names and sums. A ledger of transactions." "Exactly. He dealt in rare books, and some were quite valuable. There's a client here, one Mrs. Langford, who appears several times in the past few months. The last entry is marked with a question mark. Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Did you interview this Mrs. Langford yet?" "We've tried, but no one seems to know who she really is. A mystery purchaser, if you like. Hasn't been seen in the village." Miss Marple's mind turned over the detail. "And what of Mr. Langley, the solicitor?" "He was mentioned at the party." "Mr. Langley claims to have had little contact with Edwin recently. Though there's talk of a dispute over a disputed will." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Such disputes are often the seedbeds of resentment." As she examined the room, her eyes caught sight of a half-burnt piece of paper in the fireplace. Carefully, she retrieved it with a handkerchief. The charred fragment bore the faint imprint of writing, an address or perhaps a name. "Burnt letters," she said aloud. Someone was trying to erase something. Craddock took the fragment with interest. "We'll have it examined." "Good catch, Miss Marple." Leaving the cottage, Miss Marple felt a slight unease. The house was cluttered, but not with mere possessions. There was a sense of something hidden just beneath the surface. Later, she walked through the village, visiting familiar faces under the guise of casual greetings. At the bakery, the baker confided that Edwin had recently quarreled with someone over a shipment of rare books, an accusation of forgery, it seemed. At the post office, the young clerk mentioned the arrival of an anonymous letter addressed to Edwin a few days before his death, but it had been intercepted by mistake and returned unopened. Miss Marple listened, storing each fragment carefully. Her final call was to the vicarage, where Reverend Miles was preparing for Sunday service. "Reverend," she said quietly, "have you noticed any changes in the villagers' behavior since yesterday?" He sighed. "There's fear and suspicion. Old grievances resurface when tragedy strikes. Some have taken to avoiding the square altogether, and the newcomers. Ruth Felton seems sincere, but there's wariness. The village remembers how she left in haste years ago, and some doubt her return is for innocent reasons." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. People rarely leave without reasons that matter. That evening she sat once more with her tea and the bee brooch resting on the table. She thought of shadows, the misplaced one behind the greenhouse, the shadow cast by past secrets, and the shadow of suspicion falling unevenly across the villagers. There was one more thing, the story Ruth had told about the mysterious woman with the scarf. Miss Marple knew well that small details, overlooked by many, were the keys to unlocking the truth. The garden party, the quarrels, the ledger, the burnt letter fragments, the anonymous note, all pieces of a tangled web. Somewhere within that web was the answer. And as Miss Marple reflected, she realized the true shadow was not that which confused the direction of the sun, but the one cast by human nature itself. Ever elusive, ever deceptive, and yet to those who watch closely, never quite without shape. The morning mist that had cloaked Netherdean the day before had lifted, leaving a pale, uncertain sunshine to filter through the overhanging branches and lace the cobblestone streets with dappled light. Miss Marple, having spent a restless night turning over every detail of Edwin Leston's death in her mind, decided to revisit the scene of the garden party, now strewn with remnants of overturned chairs and crushed flower beds. The village was slowly coming to terms with the disruption, but a certain tension lingered in the air, like the dull throb of a bruise unseen but sorely felt. As she walked through the village square, Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught snippets of conversation, fragments of gossip, speculation, and outright fear. The baker was whispering with the postmaster near the butcher's shop. The vicar's wife was speaking earnestly to Mrs. McGillicuddy, and Ruth Felton stood at the edge of the crowd, her expression guarded and inscrutable. Miss Marple paused near the fountain, observing the ebb and flow of the villagers' movements, their hesitant glances toward the still taped-off garden path. She was joined unexpectedly by Constable Craddock, who offered a tentative smile. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. "We've been busy, but still no real break in the case." "People aren't exactly forthcoming with information. Understandable," she replied. "Fear can be a stubborn companion, but there is always something that slips through the cracks. A gesture, a look, a word." Craddock glanced at her with the faintest trace of admiration. "If anyone can find those cracks, it's you." Together, they made their way to the Green Man Inn, the village's customary gathering place. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the smell of wood smoke and spilled ale. Familiar faces filled the room, and the hum of uneasy conversation rose and fell like waves. Miss Marple scanned the crowd and noted several figures whose reactions she wished to observe more closely. Mr. Langley, the solicitor, sitting stiffly by the hearth. Mrs. Felton, quietly sipping tea near the window, and Mr. Cyril Barnes, a local antique dealer with a nervous twitch in his eye. "I was speaking with the vicar's wife," Miss Marple said softly to Craddock, and she mentioned an incident involving Mr. Barnes and Edwin Leston just days before the party. Craddock's brow furrowed. "What kind of incident?" "A heated disagreement over a book appraisal. Edwin accused Barnes of trying to pass off a fake as genuine." Craddock nodded. "We had heard whispers about that." "Could be a motive." Miss Marple's gaze settled on Barnes, who appeared to be avoiding eye contact. She approached him with the lightness of a casual visitor. "Mr. Barnes, isn't it? I hear you and Edwin had a rather spirited discussion recently." Barnes stiffened but forced a smile. "It's true we disagreed over a certain volume. But that's hardly cause for murder." Miss Marple inclined her head, her voice gentle but firm. "People can be driven by less. But tell me, what did you make of Edwin's recent dealings?" "I've seen a ledger. He had several unusual transactions marked with question marks." Barnes shifted uncomfortably. "Edwin was secretive about some clients. That was his business. I preferred to keep my dealings straightforward. And yet, someone went to the trouble of burning letters." "Someone tried to erase evidence." Barnes's eyes flickered. "I can't speak for others, but I'd never resort to such things." As Barnes retreated to a corner, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Mrs. Felton, who had risen and was quietly slipping out of the inn. Intrigued, Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance. Mrs. Felton walked briskly toward the village edge, where the path meandered into a wooded area. She paused beneath an ancient oak, looking around as if ensuring she was unobserved. Then, from the folds of her scarf, she withdrew a folded piece of paper and tucked it beneath a loose stone at the tree's base. Miss Marple waited until Mrs. Felton departed, then approached the tree. The paper was brittle but legible. A note written hurriedly. "The truth lies where shadows fall, but not all shadows point the way. Trust not the face that smiles too sweetly." The cryptic message stirred Miss Marple's curiosity. It was a riddle wrapped in a warning, suggesting deception and misdirection. Returning to the village, Miss Marple decided it was time to visit Mr. Langley's office. The solicitor was known for his discretion and connections, and perhaps he held pieces of the puzzle still unknown. Langley's office was a cluttered room filled with leather-bound ledgers and faded legal documents. He greeted Miss Marple with a reserved nod. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "I hope you don't mind my intrusion, Mr. Langley, but I find myself intrigued by certain matters surrounding Edwin's affairs, particularly the disputed will." Langley sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's a delicate subject. Edwin made changes to his will recently, and there was talk of contestation from his sister, Mrs. Harlow. Family disagreements can get ugly." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And yet, family is often where secrets fester most deeply." Langley hesitated, then admitted. There was a clause concerning a valuable collection Edwin possessed. He intended to bequeath it to a charity, but the details were vague. Some suspect he was reconsidering. Did anyone know of this? Only a few trusted associates. And perhaps someone who wished to prevent the change. The weight of Langley's words settled in the room. Miss Marple sensed layers of unspoken tension. As she left, the solicitor's final words echoed in her mind. "Be careful whom you trust, Miss Marple." In a place as small as Nether Dean, loyalty can be as brittle as autumn leaves. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and spread out the fragments of information. The ledger with its mysterious entries, the burnt letter fragments, the cryptic note beneath the oak, and the whispered quarrels among the villagers. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. It was Ruth Felton, looking anxious yet determined. "I felt I should come," Ruth said. "There's something I haven't told anyone, a secret I hope to keep buried." Miss Marple gestured to a chair. "Please do share." Ruth took a deep breath. "Years ago, I left Nether Dean in disgrace. It was said I had abandoned my family, but the truth is more complicated. Edwin and I had a connection, one that few knew about. I believed he was involved in things beyond his books, things that could ruin more than just reputations." Miss Marple listened intently, the pieces beginning to shift in her mind. "Why come back now?" "Because I fear someone is trying to silence the truth." Miss Marple's eyes met Ruth's. "Sometimes, the truth is the very thing people fear the most." As twilight settled over the village, Miss Marple felt the weight of the unfolding mystery pressing closer. The threads were tangled, the motives hidden beneath layers of secrecy. But one thing was certain. The shadow that pointed the wrong way was only the beginning of a far deeper deception. And she, Miss Marple, would unravel it, one quiet step at a time. The chill of early evening settled over Nether Dean as Miss Marple sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the walls of her sitting room. The day's revelations weighed heavily upon her. Ruth Felton's confession, an admission that deepened the mystery rather than simplifying it, had stirred a new undercurrent of urgency. The ties between Edwin Leston and Ruth, cloaked in secrecy for years, were a thread Miss Marple could not ignore. Yet as the village quieted and the soft ticking of the mantel clock filled the room, the puzzle pieces felt maddeningly out of reach. The ledger, the burnt letter fragments, the cryptic note beneath the oak, all hinted at a deeper game, one with stakes far beyond a petty quarrel or familial dispute. The following morning, resolute to pursue clarity, Miss Marple made her way once again to the village square. Her first stop was the small post office, where she hoped to learn more about the anonymous letter that had been returned unopened days before Edwin's death. The young clerk, a shy man named Timothy, greeted her with nervous politeness. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Timothy said, adjusting his spectacles. I've been meaning to speak to you. Something about that letter." "Yes?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Timothy lowered his voice, glancing over his shoulder as if the walls themselves might listen. "The letter was addressed to Mr. Leston, but there was no return address. When it arrived, it caused quite a stir among the staff. Some believed it might be a threat, others a confession. It was set aside, but the postmistress, she thought better of it and returned it, unopened. "Do you still have it?" Timothy nodded and retrieved a small, worn envelope from a drawer. It was yellowed and creased with no markings save for a hastily scrawled EL in the corner. Carefully, Miss Marple broke the seal and unfolded the note inside. The handwriting was rushed but legible. "Meet me at the old mill by midnight." There is more to know than the surface reveals. Trust no one but the one who bears the bee. Her heart quickened. The bee, a reference to the brooch she had found at the scene. It was no coincidence. "Thank you, Timothy," she said. "This is important." Leaving the post office, Miss Marple's thoughts raced. Someone had tried to warn or communicate with Edwin, someone who trusted only a person connected to the bee brooch. But who bore the bee? And why had Edwin ignored this message? Or worse, had he gone to meet the sender, sealing his fate? Her next destination was the old mill, a derelict structure on the outskirts of the village, long unused but a frequent haunt for clandestine meetings. She approached cautiously, the afternoon sun casting long shadows through broken windows. Inside, the air was damp and heavy with dust, but Miss Marple's keen eyes searched for clues. Near a pile of scattered stones, she spotted faint footprints leading toward a loose floorboard. Kneeling, she pried it open to reveal a small leather pouch. Inside were several old coins, a folded piece of paper, and a key, odd trinkets for a place abandoned for years. The paper bore a hastily drawn map of Nether Dean, marked with several locations including the garden where Edwin died, the oak tree, and an unmarked spot near the river bank. Miss Marple pocketed the items and stepped back into the waning light. The map suggested someone was orchestrating events from behind the scenes, linking places and people in a hidden network. Returning to the village, she visited Mrs. McGillicuddy, whose sharp mind and vast knowledge of local history were invaluable. Over tea, she shared the map and the mysterious letter. "Now, Miss Marple," Mrs. McGillicuddy said, peering over her glasses, "the riverbank has always been a spot for secret meetings. Old smugglers' paths, you know. It wouldn't surprise me if Edwin had uncovered something that threatened powerful interests, or someone," Miss Marple agreed, "who wanted to keep those interests safe." That afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Mr. Cyril Barnes once more. The antique dealer, still nervous from their previous encounter, was more forthcoming this time. "I'll be honest," he admitted. "I didn't like Edwin much, but I respected his knowledge. He was on to something, a secret about a rare collection he'd recently acquired. Something worth far more than money. Did Edwin say what it was?" Barnes hesitated. "Only that it could change everything we thought we knew about Nether Dean's past." Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. Was Edwin's murder connected to this secret? As dusk fell, she returned home with the day's discoveries swirling in her mind. That evening, a sharp knock startled her. At the door stood Constable Craddock, flushed and breathless. "Miss Marple," he said urgently, "there's been a development." "What is it?" "Someone's broken into the solicitor's office, ransacked the place. Papers are missing, including the will and some correspondence." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "They're trying to erase evidence. We've found footprints leading toward the river." The pieces clicked into place. The riverbank marked on the map, the missing documents, the secret meetings, all pointed toward a hidden truth someone would kill to protect. Determined, Miss Marple gathered her coat. "We must follow those footprints before they disappear." Together, they hurried toward the river under a sky thick with stars, the silent water reflecting the moon's cold gaze. Somewhere in the shadows lay the secret Edwin died trying to reveal, and Miss Marple was closer than ever to unraveling the mystery that had gripped Nether Dean in fear. The moon hung low over Nether Dean, casting a pale silvery glow on the winding path that led from the village toward the river bank. Miss Marple and Constable Craddock moved carefully along the muddy trail, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath. The air was heavy with the scent of damp leaves and distant water, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures stirring in the undergrowth. "Look here," Craddock whispered, halting as he pointed to a series of deep impressions pressed into the soft soil near the water's edge. "These footprints are fresh, probably from earlier this evening." Miss Marple bent down, her sharp eyes narrowing as she studied the marks. "They lead toward the old boathouse," she murmured. "That's been abandoned for years, but someone has recently been using it." Together they crept forward, the wooden structure looming like a dark sentinel beside the river. Its peeling paint and broken windows gave it a forlorn appearance, but tonight it held the promise of answers, or peril. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of mildew. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room, resting on overturned crates and splintered floorboards. Near a corner, a faint glimmer caught her eye, a small folded piece of paper half hidden beneath a broken plank. Gently, she retrieved it. The paper was a torn fragment from a ledger, the handwriting elegant but hurried. It listed several names, dates, and figures, numbers that seemed to correspond to payments or debts. One entry stood out: J. Felton, settlement pending. "Ruth's name," Miss Marple said softly. "It appears she was expecting money or perhaps compensation." Craddock frowned. "Could this be the motive for the murder?" "Not yet," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. "But it is a thread worth pulling." Suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the shadows. A soft scraping, as if someone was moving stealthily outside. They exchanged a glance, instinctively reaching for their coats as a figure emerged from the darkness near the boathouse door. "Who's there?" Craddock called. The figure froze, then stepped forward into the moonlight. It was the vicar, Reverend Alden, his face pale but composed. "Miss Marple, Constable, forgive my intrusion," he said quietly. "I heard voices and came to see if everything was all right." Miss Marple regarded him keenly. "Reverend, you are a late visitor." "I was returning from a meeting in the village," he explained, "and passed by the river." Something seemed amiss. Craddock lowered his guard, but kept a wary eye on the vicar. "We found this ledger fragment inside the boathouse." The Reverend took the paper and glanced over it. His face darkened slightly. "Ah, the Felton settlement. It has caused much unrest." "Unrest you know about?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but probing. The vicar sighed. "Ruth's husband, Jack Felton, has been ill and unable to manage his affairs. The settlement was meant to provide for their future, but it has been delayed due to legal complications." Miss Marple nodded. "And who benefits if the settlement never reaches Ruth?" "Some in the village stand to gain," he admitted, "but I believe none would resort to murder." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with quiet determination. "Belief is often a comfort, Reverend, but the truth requires closer scrutiny." With the vicar accompanying them, they left the boathouse and returned to the village, the weight of the night pressing upon their shoulders. The following morning, Miss Marple decided to revisit the Felton household. The atmosphere there was tense. Ruth was pale and withdrawn, while Jack's condition appeared more fragile than ever. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chambers, was cautious but cooperative. "Miss Marple?" Ruth whispered. "I don't know who could have done this." "Edwin was a friend, but lately he seemed troubled by secrets he wouldn't share." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "Secrets are the currency of small villages, dear. They often surface when least expected." Mrs. Chambers interrupted, her voice trembling. "I saw Jack arguing with Edwin last week. Something about money. Settlements, they said." "Did anyone else witness this?" Miss Marple inquired. "No, ma'am." It was late in the evening, just the two of them. The mention of the argument deepened the mystery. Had Edwin threatened to expose something that could harm the Feltons? Or was there another angle altogether? Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the map from the old mill, the ledger fragment, and the missing solicitor's documents. The tangled web was growing more complex by the hour. Later, as she walked back through the village, she passed the local pub, the King's Head, where a crowd had gathered, animated voices spilling into the street. Curious, she paused and overheard snippets of conversation. "Have you heard about the solicitor's office? Ransacked, they say. Someone's trying to cover their tracks. They say it's the Feltons, or perhaps the Lestons." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with knowing. Gossip, as always, was a double-edged sword, revealing much and yet little at once. That afternoon, she visited Mr. Reginald Leston, Edwin's brother, at their family home. He was a man burdened by grief and suspicion, eager to find answers, yet guarded in his demeanor. Edwin was a good man, Reginald said quietly, but he made enemies. "I fear the worst is yet to come." Miss Marple gently steered the conversation toward Edwin's recent dealings. Was Edwin involved in any disputes over property or inheritance? Reginald hesitated. There was talk of a disputed will. Father's will was complicated, and Edwin had contested some provisions. Could this dispute have led to murder? Perhaps, Reginald admitted, but I would never believe my brother capable of stirring such trouble without cause. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, noting the tension between family loyalty and hidden grievances. Returning home that evening, she sat by the fire once more, reviewing her notes and reflecting on the day's events. The threads were slowly weaving together. The secret settlement, the missing documents, the map marked with points of interest, and the quiet undercurrents of jealousy and resentment among the villagers. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Dr. Hayward, the village physician, a man known for his calm demeanor and sharp intellect. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside, "there's something I think you should know. It concerns Jack Felton's condition." She gestured for him to continue. "Jack's illness is progressing unusually fast. I suspect poisoning, but the symptoms are subtle, easily mistaken for natural decline." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Poisoning?" "Yes. I have taken a sample to the lab, but it will take time for the results." "Who would wish to harm Jack Felton?" "That is the question," Dr. Hayward said gravely. "But it suggests the Felton household is more deeply involved in this mystery than we thought." As the doctor left, Miss Marple felt a renewed sense of purpose. The hidden dangers beneath Nether Dean's quaint surface were more perilous than she had imagined. With each discovery, the true nature of the shadows lengthened, pointing not where the village expected, but where only a keen mind could see. The game was far from over. The village of Nether Dean woke to an unusual chill that morning, as if the very air sensed the deepening mystery that now gripped its heart. Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the early mist drift lazily across the garden, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup absently. The doctor's words from the previous evening lingered heavily in her mind. Poisoning. It was a grim possibility, and one that added a new urgency to her thoughts. Her visitor had left her with much to consider. Jack Felton's decline might no longer be attributed to mere illness. If someone had sought to hasten his end, then the web of motives extended far beyond simple disputes and village gossip. Miss Marple's reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Constable Craddock, his face pale and drawn. "Miss Marple, you might want to come quickly." There's been another development. Without hesitation, she donned her coat and followed him briskly through the waking village. The news had spread fast. A second crime scene awaited their attention. The village's fragile calm was fracturing before her eyes. At the edge of the village green, a small crowd had gathered near the old mill. The mill, now long out of use, was a favorite meeting place for villagers, but tonight it stood somber and foreboding. There, sprawled across the worn cobblestones, lay a body, none other than Reginald Leston. Miss Marple knelt beside the fallen man, noting the pale streaks on his face and the unnatural angle of his limbs. No obvious wound marked his body, but the expression of shock frozen upon his features suggested a sudden, violent end. Craddock whispered, "It looks like he suffered a heart attack, but that doesn't explain everything." Miss Marple's sharp eyes searched the area. There was something odd about the positioning of Reginald's hands. Clutched tightly was a small scrap of paper, crumpled and stained. She carefully eased it from his grasp and smoothed it out. The handwriting was hurried, nearly illegible in parts, but one phrase stood clear: "Meet me at the mill. Midnight. Truth must be told." Her mind raced. A clandestine meeting arranged in secret. The location, the time, the promise of revelation, all pointed to a desperate desire to unveil something hidden. Someone wanted Reginald to come here, she mused aloud. But who and why? The crowd murmured amongst themselves. Among them was Mrs. Chambers, the Felton housekeeper who had come to investigate the commotion. Her face was drawn tight with fear and exhaustion. "Mrs. Chambers," Miss Marple called gently, "you seem troubled. Did Reginald mention any secret meetings or worries to you?" The woman hesitated, but then nodded. "Yes, ma'am." He was worried. "Said there were things better left buried, but that sometimes the truth won't stay hidden." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Do you know what truth he referred to?" "No," Mrs. Chambers whispered, "but I overheard him speaking with Edwin Felton recently. They argued about some papers, documents that could change everything." "Documents," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "That aligns with the ledger fragment and the missing solicitor's files." As the crowd began to disperse, Miss Marple and Craddock remained behind, piecing together the fragments of this new puzzle. The silence around the mill seemed to press inward, as if the stones themselves held secrets. "Reginald's death changes everything," Craddock said. "This can't be natural." "No, it cannot," Miss Marple agreed quietly. "This is no longer just about money or inheritance. Someone is determined to silence those who get too close to the truth." Her thoughts drifted to the solicitor's office, ransacked just days before, and to the strange behavior of certain villagers who had seemed overly eager to steer suspicion away from themselves. The undercurrent of fear was palpable. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple arranged to visit the solicitor's widow, Mrs. Edith Penrose. Her small cottage on the outskirts of the village was neat but worn, reflecting years of modest living. She welcomed Miss Marple with a tremulous smile, her eyes shadowed with grief. "Edith," Miss Marple began gently, "I understand Edwin Felton had business with your late husband. Did he mention anything to you before he died?" Mrs. Penrose hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Yes, he was worried about some papers he was holding. Documents relating to a will and something about an old land dispute. He said he was afraid someone might try to take them from him." "Did he tell you who?" Miss Marple asked. "No names." Just that the documents were important enough to cause harm, Miss Marple's mind flashed back to the crumpled note found on Reginald and the mention of a midnight meeting. Someone had tried to confront or exchange information under cover of darkness. The timing was no coincidence. "Have you seen any of these documents recently?" she asked. Mrs. Penrose shook her head. "No, they disappeared after Edwin's death. I fear someone took them from the solicitor's office during the break-in." The weight of this revelation settled heavily. Whoever had stolen the documents was likely the same person who orchestrated the murder, or perhaps several of the deaths now shadowing Netherdean. As she left the cottage, Miss Marple's keen gaze caught a familiar figure lurking near the village square. Mr. Albert Granger, the local postman. His usually cheerful demeanor was replaced with nervous glances and tight lips. Deciding to follow him discreetly, Miss Marple and Craddock trailed him through twisting lanes until he stopped near a hedge and slipped a small bundle into a hollow tree trunk. With practiced calm, Miss Marple waited until he left before retrieving the bundle. Inside were several torn pages, fragments from the missing documents, hastily stuffed and abandoned. She carefully examined the papers, noting references to a long-forgotten deed in a disputed parcel of land that had once belonged to the Leston family but was now claimed by a shadowy business interest. The potential for scandal, financial ruin, and betrayal was immense. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, piecing the strands together. The conflict over land, the missing documents, the hurried meetings, and the deaths all seemed linked by a common thread. Someone desperate to hide the truth behind the village's tranquil facade. Her thoughts turned to the Feltons, the Lestons, and the many others who might be entangled in this web. The danger was escalating, and she knew the killer was watching, waiting for the next move. Yet Miss Marple's confidence never wavered. She had learned long ago that beneath the surface of human nature, lies revealed themselves to the patient observer. All that remained was to watch, to listen, and to wait for the shadow to point the way true, not the way false. The game was indeed afoot. The days that followed carried with them a restless tension that settled over Netherdean like a gathering storm. Miss Marple found herself observing the village with renewed scrutiny, noting small shifts in demeanor and subtle glances exchanged beneath lowered eyelids. The peace that once defined the village had fractured, replaced by an undercurrent of suspicion and unease. Her discovery of the torn documents hidden near the tree hollow had injected new urgency into the investigation. Whoever had secreted those papers so hurriedly was deeply entangled in the unfolding drama. But who and what exactly did those fragments reveal? Miss Marple began by sharing her findings with Constable Craddock, who met the revelation with a furrowed brow. "This land dispute might be the key," he said thoughtfully. "If those documents prove ownership, it could ruin several families standing here, and might also explain the desperate attempts to retrieve or suppress them," Miss Marple added quietly. "But we must be cautious. It is often the quieter voices, the seemingly peripheral players, who hold the vital threads." Her thoughts returned to Albert Granger, the postman. His nervousness and furtive actions made him an enigma. Yet, when confronted by Craddock, he protested innocence and claimed to have hidden the papers to protect them from being destroyed. Miss Marple was unconvinced, but noted his story. "Sometimes fear drives people to strange deeds," she remarked, "but fear can also be a veil for guilt." With this in mind, she resolved to deepen her inquiries into the key families connected to the land dispute. That afternoon, she made her way to the Felton estate, a grand house shadowed by towering elms and the weight of history. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chambers, greeted her at the door with a mix of relief and apprehension. "Miss Marple, I'm glad you've come." Edwin's brother, Lawrence Felton, arrived this morning, and his presence seems to stir unrest among the staff and villagers alike. Lawrence Felton was known as a stern man, pragmatic and reserved, a contrast to his late brother's more amiable nature. His arrival coincided with the unsettling news of Reginald Leston's death, and his intentions remained unclear. Miss Marple accepted the invitation to meet him in the drawing-room. Lawrence sat by the fire, his fingers steepled in thought, eyes sharp beneath heavy brows. "Miss Marple," he greeted with a nod, "I trust you understand why I've come. Edwin's affairs require my oversight, and I intend to see them resolved swiftly." "Your timing is indeed significant," she replied mildly. "There are troubling matters regarding your brother's documents and recent events in the village." Lawrence's expression darkened slightly. Edwin was careless with such matters. If there are papers missing or damaged, it is regrettable. But I assure you, my priority is restoring order. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on his hands, noting a faint tremor despite his composed exterior. "Might I ask, sir, if you had any disagreements with your brother over these matters?" He hesitated, then admitted, "We differed in opinion on handling the estate. Edwin was more sentimental. I am more practical. Pragmatism can sometimes demand difficult decisions," she observed gently. Before the conversation could continue, a servant entered with a message. A local farmer, Mr. Hopkins, requested an urgent word with Miss Marple. Curious, she excused herself and made her way to the village edge where the farmer's weathered face greeted her with evident worry. "There's been talk, Miss Marple," he began, "about strange goings-on near the old quarry. Lights at night, shadows moving where none should be. Some say it's nothing, but I fear it might be connected." The quarry was a long-abandoned site, overgrown and isolated. A perfect place for clandestine meetings or hiding incriminating evidence. Miss Marple decided to investigate that very evening. As dusk settled, she ventured to the quarry's edge, the cool air carrying a scent of damp earth and wildflowers. The place was silent, save for the distant hoot of an owl. Suddenly, a faint flicker of light caught her eye, a lantern moving cautiously between jagged rocks. She followed at a distance, careful to remain unseen. Through the shadows, she glimpsed two figures speaking in hushed tones. One was unmistakably Lawrence Felton, the other, a woman she recognized as Beatrice Leston, Reginald's widow. Their conversation was tense. "You promised to keep this quiet," Lawrence said sharply. "If these documents surface, everything will unravel." Beatrice's voice was low but resolute. "The truth cannot be buried forever. Reginald died for this secret, and I intend to see justice done." Miss Marple's mind raced. Beatrice's involvement suggested layers of motivation beyond mere inheritance or land. Could there be old grievances or hidden alliances she had yet to uncover? Before she could listen further, a twig snapped beneath her foot. Both figures turned sharply, their eyes narrowing into the darkness. Miss Marple stepped forward, raising a hand in greeting. "I didn't mean to intrude. I think we share an interest in uncovering the truth." For a moment, silence stretched, then Lawrence's voice, cold and measured. "Miss Marple, you are persistent, I see. But some truths are better left in shadow." Beatrice glanced at Lawrence, then back to Miss Marple. "Perhaps it is time all shadows were brought into the light." The three stood on the quarry's edge, the past and present converging in that quiet place. Miss Marple sensed that the fragile balance of secrets was shifting. The final pieces of the puzzle were beginning to move, each step drawing her closer to the heart of the mystery, and the identity of the one who sought to silence the truth at any cost. As the moon climbed higher, casting silver light over the stones, Miss Marple knew the game was far from over. But now, the shadow that had pointed the wrong way was beginning to fall away, revealing the path she must follow. The encounter at the quarry lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts as the days grew shorter and the village settled uneasily into autumn's embrace. Beatrice Leston's words, defiant and tinged with grief, reverberated in her mind. "Perhaps it is time all shadows were brought into the light." The phrase seemed to summon the very heart of the mystery, a call for truth amidst the tangled web of secrets. Miss Marple had never underestimated grief's power to awaken long-buried passions. It was a force that could both illuminate and obscure, sharpen motives or cloud judgment. And in Nether Dean, where history entwined with pride and rivalry, the shadows had stretched far too long. The morning after the quarry meeting, Miss Marple returned to her own cozy sitting room, where the familiar scent of lavender and old books offered a small comfort against the storm gathering beyond the village gates. She poured herself a cup of tea and allowed her thoughts to settle on the details she had gathered so far. Lawrence Felton's arrival, his cold practicality, and now his secretive meeting with Beatrice suggested a calculated attempt to control the narrative and perhaps to bury inconvenient truths. Beatrice, on the other hand, was a figure of quiet strength, her determination rooted in loss and an unyielding desire for justice. and Albert Granger's odd behavior still nagged at her, as though the nervous postman held a key she had yet to discover. Her mind drifted back to the torn documents. What exact secrets did they conceal? Land ownership disputes seemed to be only part of the story. There was something deeper, a hidden grievance that had festered beneath the village's polite surface. Her reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Constable Craddock, his face lined with concern. "Miss Marple, there's been a development. You might want to come to the village hall. It's important." Together, they walked through the crisp air, the streets of Netherdean quiet except for the occasional rustle of fallen leaves. The village hall stood at the center of the village, a modest building where townsfolk gathered for meetings and social events. Today, it had taken on a different character, somber and charged. Inside, a small group had assembled, including some of the principal villagers Miss Marple had come to know so well. The atmosphere was thick with whispered speculation and uneasy glances. Mayor Henderson stepped forward to address the group. "This morning, a new piece of evidence has come to light." A letter, discovered in the archives of the parish church, written by Edwin Felton himself, was found hidden in the lining of an old box. He handed the letter to Constable Craddock, who read aloud the neat, looping script. "My dearest brother Lawrence, I fear the day will come when these matters cause more harm than good. If anything should happen to me, I beg you to consider carefully before acting on the property dispute. There are debts unpaid and promises broken that may endanger more than just our family's name." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as the letter settled over the room like a dense fog. The contents confirmed her suspicion that Edwin's death was not a simple accident or a random act of violence. It was intertwined with a complex legacy of grudges and unresolved conflicts. Beatrice, seated in the front row, appeared pale but resolute. "He was warning against rash actions," she said softly. "But now Edwin is gone, and the village is divided." The mayor nodded gravely. "We must proceed carefully." "Any accusation without proof risks tearing the village apart," Miss Marple quietly approached Beatrice after the meeting. "Your husband spoke of debts and promises," she said gently. "Did he confide in you about who might wish him harm?" Beatrice hesitated, then shook her head. "He spoke little of his enemies, but I sensed he feared someone close." Perhaps a friend turned foe. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. The letter spoke of danger hidden within familiar faces. The murderer, she realized, was likely someone known and trusted whose resentment had simmered beneath polite smiles and village manners. In the days that followed, Miss Marple took a more deliberate approach, visiting the homes of those connected to Edwin Felton and the disputed land. She observed their routines, their interactions, and the subtle tensions that prickled beneath their words. Mrs. Chambers, the Felton housekeeper, was a treasure trove of quiet observations. She spoke of late-night visitors, hushed conversations behind closed doors, and a mounting sense of fear among the staff. There was talk of money owed to the wrong people, Mrs. Chambers confided, and threats made in whispers. But no one dared say it openly. The postman, Albert Granger, remained a mystery. He seemed increasingly agitated, avoiding eye contact and shifting nervously whenever questioned about his movements on the night of the murder. One afternoon, Miss Marple found herself in the village churchyard, where she noticed a small detail that had escaped previous notice, a faded inscription on a weathered headstone belonging to an old Felton ancestor. The engraving hinted at a long-standing feud between the Feltons and another local family, the Hargraves. Could the old family rivalry have rekindled? Had past grievances ignited a present-day tragedy? As evening fell, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind weaving the threads of suspicion, fear, and grief into a tapestry that still concealed the true face of the murderer. A knock on her door brought Constable Craddock with urgent news. "Miss Marple, there's been another incident at the quarry." Someone's tampered with the evidence. The torn papers have been stolen. Miss Marple's heart sank. The shadows had deepened once again, the path to truth growing darker and more perilous. But she was certain of one thing: the real murderer was growing desperate. Their carefully constructed facade was cracking under the weight of exposure. With steady resolve, Miss Marple prepared herself for the next step, a delicate game of observation and subtle provocation designed to reveal the one who believed themselves beyond suspicion. The village of Nether held its breath, caught between fear and hope, as the shadow that had pointed the wrong way began to shrink, revealing the true silhouette hidden beneath. The theft of the torn documents sent ripples of alarm through Nether. In a village so small and close-knit, such a brazen act was almost unthinkable. Yet the removal of evidence was a clear sign the murderer was neither distant nor detached, but someone entwined with the very fabric of the community. Miss Marple understood that this act was both a warning and a desperate attempt to control the unfolding investigation. Miss Marple convened a discreet meeting with Constable Craddock in her sitting room, the familiar space now charged with a new urgency. "The disappearance of those papers," she said quietly, "tells us more than it hides. Whoever took them knows their value intimately, and that suggests a degree of recklessness born of fear." Craddock nodded grimly. "But without the papers, it's harder to tie anyone down." "We're back to relying on testimonies and observation." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied, "and it is in observation that we shall find our answer." The criminal always reveals themselves in the small, involuntary gestures, the fleeting glance, the pause in conversation, the slip of the tongue. Over the following days, Miss Marple immersed herself in the village's rhythm with renewed focus. She attended the gatherings at the village pub, where suspicion mingled with gossip like smoke in the air. She visited the Felton estate under the guise of offering condolences once more, but really to observe the subtle interactions between those who lived there. Mrs. Chambers, the housekeeper, was the first to note a change. "There's a tension, Miss Marple," she confided in a rare moment of candor, "especially from Mr. Lawrence. He's grown more withdrawn, almost cold. And Beatrice, she's not the same woman." The grief has sharpened her. Miss Marple had sensed as much during her visits. Beatrice's once gentle demeanor was now steeled by purpose, her grief transformed into a quiet determination that both commanded respect and hinted at deeper layers of pain. The postman, Albert Granger, meanwhile, remained elusive. Miss Marple arranged to meet him casually on his rounds, engaging him in light conversation while watching for signs of nervousness. His eyes darted frequently, and he stumbled over simple questions, but when pressed gently, he revealed only fragments. A disputed parcel, a whispered argument overheard near the quarry, and a cryptic remark about debts owed. It was the last detail that Miss Marple found most intriguing. Debts were a recurring motif in the story. The debts Edwin Felton had mentioned in his letter, the financial strains whispered about by the servants, and now this shadowy reference by Granger. One afternoon, as the sun cast long amber streaks over the village, Miss Marple visited the Hargraves' farm. The Hargraves were an old family, their name woven into the village's history as deeply as the Feltons'. There she met Harold Hargrave, a man of weathered hands and guarded expressions. "I hear there was an old feud between your family and the Feltons," Miss Marple remarked casually as they stood by the barn. Harold's face tightened. "Old tales, Miss Marple. Nothing worth dredging up now. We've all moved on." Yet his words rang hollow. There was a hardness in his eyes that suggested old wounds still ached beneath the surface. The next day, Miss Marple returned to the quarry, retracing the steps she had taken weeks before. The spot where Edwin Felton had been found bore a new kind of silence, a stillness that whispered of secrets better left untouched. Yet as she walked the perimeter, her keen eyes caught sight of an oddly disturbed patch of earth beneath a bramble. Beneath the tangled growth lay a small leather pouch, half buried and weathered by time. Inside were several coins and a folded note, the ink faded but legible enough to read, "For debts unpaid, the reckoning is near." The note was unsigned, but its presence confirmed what Miss Marple had suspected. Someone was sending a message cloaked in menace. The debts were more than financial. They were debts of honor, betrayal, and revenge. Back in the village, the atmosphere grew taut. The villagers watched one another with suspicion, and the once festive air of community gave way to wary glances and hushed conversations. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was formulating her next step. She knew that the murderer thrived in deception, but faltered under subtle pressure. She planned to provoke a reaction, to unsettle the killer enough that their own fears would betray them. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. At the weekly parish tea, an event that brought most of Netherdean together in a fragile truce, Miss Marple carefully introduced a conversation about loyalty and secrets. She spoke gently of how the truth often hides in plain sight, masked by the comfort of routine and familiar faces. Her words caused a ripple of unease. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others offered polite nods, concealing their true feelings. Miss Marple watched, attentive to the smallest details. The tightening of a jaw, the flicker of eyes avoiding contact, the way a hand clutched a teacup as if for support. Beatrice Leston was present, her expression unreadable but composed. Lawrence Felton arrived later, his usual cold reserve replaced by a guarded politeness that failed to mask his growing impatience. It was Albert Granger who betrayed himself most vividly. When Miss Marple casually mentioned the missing papers, a sudden pallor swept over his face. His breath caught, and his fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his cup. The slightest hesitation, but enough for Miss Marple to notice. Later, as the tea concluded and the villagers dispersed, Miss Marple found a quiet moment to speak with Constable Craddock. Granger's reaction was telling. I suspect he knows more than he lets on, and fear has begun to unravel his composure. Craddock nodded. Shall we bring him in for questioning? Not yet, Miss Marple replied. We must be certain before we act. The wrong accusation would only deepen the wounds in this village. That evening, Miss Marple penned a careful letter to Beatrice, inviting her to the cottage under the pretense of seeking comfort and sharing thoughts. She suspected Beatrice held a vital piece of the puzzle, and a private conversation might coax it free. Beatrice arrived just before dusk, her eyes shadowed but steady. They sat by the fire, the quiet crackle providing a steady rhythm to the delicate dance of words. Miss Marple, Beatrice began, her voice soft but firm, there are things I've not told anyone. Things Edwin and I feared would destroy us if they came to light. Miss Marple leaned in gently, encouraging her to continue. There were promises made long ago between families, promises that were broken. Edwin discovered evidence that someone was trying to erase those promises, to rewrite history for personal gain. She paused, eyes glistening. I believe that someone is still watching, waiting, and willing to kill to protect their secret. Miss Marple reached out, placing a reassuring hand over Beatrice's. You have shown great courage. The shadows may be long, but they cannot hide the truth forever. As the night deepened, the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together in Miss Marple's mind. The debts, the threats, the stolen documents, and the fearful glances all pointed to a complex web of betrayal involving those closest to Edwin Felton. But the final move had yet to be made. The true murderer, sensing the tightening noose, would soon reveal themselves in the crucial moment Miss Marple had been quietly orchestrating. And when they did, the shadow that had misled the village would finally dissolve, leaving justice to shine through the quiet streets of Netherdean once more. The morning air in Netherdean held a brittle chill, as if the village itself was bracing for a reckoning long overdue. Miss Marple awoke with a quiet determination. The moments ahead would unravel the tangled threads that had ensnared so many lives. Her invitation to the villagers, under the guise of a small gathering at her cottage, was met with wary curiosity, but one by one they arrived, each carrying their own burdens, their own secrets. As they settled into the cozy parlor, Miss Marple began with a gentle tone, inviting reflection on the nature of truth and the shadows cast by deceit. Her eyes, calm yet penetrating, flicked from one face to another, observing the flickers of emotion that betrayed hidden fears. She spoke of the torn documents, the missing papers, and the faded note found by the quarry. These were not mere happenstance, she said softly. They were pieces of a puzzle, deliberately scattered to confuse and to mislead. But what we overlook in our search for evidence is often the simplest truth, that human nature itself reveals the guilty. Turning to Albert Granger, Miss Marple's voice grew more measured. Mr. Granger, your reactions have not escaped notice. The tremor in your hand, the hesitation when the papers were mentioned, it is the mark of someone burdened with a secret. Granger's face paled, his composure slipping. He began, but Miss Marple held up a hand. Please, hear me out. You were desperate to hide what you took, but it was not merely the papers you sought to conceal, was it? It was the truth behind the debts, the old grudges that have poisoned Nether Dean's peaceful veneer. A silence fell, thick and heavy, before Granger's defenses crumbled. I did it, he confessed in a low voice. Not the murder. No, but I took the papers to protect someone. I feared what would happen if the past was unearthed. Miss Marple nodded gently, encouraging him to continue. The debts, they were more than money owed. They were about promises broken between the Feltons and the Hargraves, promises that would ruin families. Edwin discovered something that threatened to expose, that the room shifted as Harold Hargrave's expression darkened. Miss Marple's gaze settled upon him next. You, Mr. Hargrave, did you feel the weight of those broken promises? Did fear drive you to desperate measures? Harold's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Miss Marple turned her attention then to Beatrice Felton, who sat with quiet dignity. Mrs. Felton, your strength has been remarkable. Yet I believe you, too, held knowledge that could have altered the course of events. Beatrice met her gaze steadily. Edwin was a man of honor. When he confronted the truth, he threatened to expose years of deceit. It was not only his life he risked, but the peace of this village. Miss Marple paused, then, with a soft smile, revealed the final truth. The murder was born, not of greed alone, but of a desire to protect a fragile peace. The true killer is someone who could blend into the everyday life of Nether Dean, someone whose shadow pointed everyone in the wrong direction. She fixed her gaze on Lawrence Felton. You, Mr. Felton, could not bear the stain your family's past might leave. In your attempt to guard your name and your sister's future, you committed a grave wrong. Lawrence's face paled, his hands trembling as the weight of exposure pressed upon him. I did it to protect Beatrice, to stop Edwin from destroying everything. The room seemed to hold its breath as Lawrence lowered his eyes, the confession complete. Miss Marple's voice was kind, yet firm. It is a heavy burden to bear, but justice must be served. Only through truth can a village heal. As the constable moved to take Lawrence into custody, the villagers exchanged glances, some relieved, others somber. The shadow that had pointed the wrong way was lifted, revealing the complexities beneath the village's calm exterior. Later, as quiet returned to Nether Dean, Miss Marple sat in her chair, a cup of tea warming her hands. She reflected on the fragile threads that hold human nature together: pride, fear, love, and the secrets we bury deep. In the stillness, she found a measure of peace, knowing that beneath the surface, life would go on, shaped forever by the truths uncovered that day.